Turkey rushes to Qatar's side during a standoff with the Gulf country's neighbors. President Erdogan promises food and troops, but is it enough to keep Doha stable? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the GCC crisis. Allies of Qatar and its GCC neighbors are taking sides in a diplomatic spat that's spilling over into what could be a humanitarian crisis. On the side of Doha is Turkey. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has called for a blockade on Qatar to be lifted. He's also sending food and troops. In the meantime, Amnesty International says countries in the Gulf are potentially splitting apart 6,000 families by ordering all Qatari nationals back home. Then there's the Saudi-led coalition who says Qatar has reached too far on the world stage. In its corner is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who has called Qatar a sponsor of terror. He says Qatar must stop funding groups the U.S. considers to be terrorist organizations. They include the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. So can Turkey and the U.S. mediate this conflict, or are they fanning the flames? Let's get the conversation started with this report by Natalie Perhonen.
Turkey and Qatar have long been brothers in arms. And now, during Doha's most critical diplomatic crisis in decades, Ankara has openly pledged its solidarity.
Katar'daki kardeşlerimizin yanında olmak, onlara gıda yardımında bulunmak, onlara gıda ihraç etmek, ilaç vesaire ihraç etmekten dolayı rahatsız olanlar var. Kusura bakmayın. Biz Katar'a her türlü desteği vermeye devam edeceğiz.
President Erdogan says that move is not about choosing sides in the rift, which began with a Saudi-led coalition of countries cutting ties and closing borders with Qatar. But Turkey did take a stand in the row last week, when Parliament approved legislation to deploy troops to Qatar. The bill was not new, but the decision was seen as the strongest signal yet of Turkey's intentions in the Gulf crisis.
The base that we are building in Qatar is aimed at contributing to the security of the entire Gulf region. It is not aimed at a specific Gulf state.
The Turkish Army's Land Forces Command in Qatar is home to about 90 soldiers. A delegation is due to head there this week for inspections. And once a permanent base is complete, it could house up to 5,000 troops. It's not the only area of cooperation. Qatar is an important trading partner, with Qatari investments in Turkey amounting to more than $1 billion in 2016. But one of the most important connections lies in the two governments' shared support for the Muslim Brotherhood. President Erdogan has said that the organization is an ideological one, and he does not view it as a terrorist group. Saudi Arabia and Egypt do. In its list of demands to Qatar, Saudi Arabia and its partners have told Doha it needs to cut links to groups, including Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and expel its members. And there's strong support for it from the Oval Office.
We have to stop the funding of terrorism. I decided, along with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, our great generals and military people, the time had come to call on Qatar to end its funding.
A complete contrast to Turkey's view.
Ve Katar'ın bugüne kadar teröre destek verdiğine ben şahit olmadım.
For now, Qatar's future remains uncertain. Will the fault lines between its supporters and its enemies deepen? Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mithat Rende from Iskenderun. He's the former Turkish ambassador to Qatar. And from Madrid, Salman Al-Ansari, who's the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. And we're also joined by Sultan Barakat. He's the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Mithat Rende, Ambassador, if I could begin with you first, sir. Turkey's support for Qatar in this context, at this time, does it make sense to you?
It's most unfortunate that this crisis has erupted at a time when the international community focused on fighting ISIL, when hundreds of thousands of people are trapped in Mosul and in Raqqa. So this crisis, if it's a diplomatic crisis, it is considered as a diplomatic crisis with all the sanctions applied, should be resolved by negotiations, by meaningful negotiations through mediation and by peaceful means. So through diplomacy, we should be able to diffuse the crisis and to narrow differences between and among the Gulf states. And therefore, I think that Turkey should put all its efforts to mediate between the different Gulf states and to try to achieve a peaceful solution.
Ambassador Rende, before I move on to the other guests, if you were ambassador in Qatar right now, if you were in your old job, would you be worried?
I would try to do my best to convince our Qatari friends that they should continue to insist in dialogue and to open all lines of communication open and not to reciprocate to the sanctions and all these measures taken by other Gulf states. I would do my best to help our leadership to try to convince also other Gulf states that what we need in the Gulf is to improve understanding. What we need is tolerance, understanding each other. What we need is a culture of peace to enhance solidarity and the culture of peace, because what our people they want to live in peace and in prosperity, and they don't want to fight each other for certain interests. I understand that there are different interpretations of Islam by different religious groups in the Gulf. We should be able to tolerate other people's interpretation of Islam, but what we should not tolerate is, of course, terrorism and fanaticism.
Right, and I guess that's where many of these countries differ. The Saudis define terrorism differently to Turkey and so on. Salman, Turkey is not just sending milk and eggs to Qatar, it's also sending troops and it's beefing up an airbase. Did the GCC countries, with the Saudi leading them, did they underestimate the type of support the Qataris were going to get from the likes of Turkey?
Basically, I think Saudi Arabia is wanting to give a signal to the world, specifically after the Riyadh summit, because we have to look at this case through the lens of the Riyadh summit, when more than 50 Muslim leaders got together with the President of the United States and created a complete new strategy to combat terrorism and to combat all the funders of terrorism and all the people who advocate for terrorism. So let's speak about the facts before we get into this question, which is Qatar has been basically put in the sanctioned list. Some of the people, Qataris, have been put in the sanctioned list in the Treasury Department in 2013, and they still live in Qatar without any issue, as-Subai'i and al-Nu'aimi. And David Cohen, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Department, talked about this for so long. The only country in the GCC that was actually supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda in Syria, is Qatar. And the only country in the GCC that supports Fajr Libya militia in Libya is Qatar. And the only GCC country that supports all non-state actors in the region is Qatar. So those things need to be stopped. Those things need to be stopped because right now we have a complete new dynamics in the decision of combating terrorism, or in the idea of combating terrorism. So Saudi Arabia has been so patient with Qatar for so long. When it comes to Turkey, I think the Turkish political fabric needs to understand that what the Qatari is doing is basically undermining the Turkish interest in the Middle East. It might sound surprising, but this is the true fact. Because if you go and see the amount of propaganda that the Qataris are doing by making Turkey to look like a caliphate, not as a democracy.
So let's take that and ask Sultan. Sure, okay, fair point. Let's take that. So Sultan Salman goes and he spelled out the Saudi perspective, right? There's a perspective there that Qatar is at the heart. Wherever you find trouble in the region, you'll find the fingerprints of Qatar, and he feels Turkey is being played by the Qataris. How do you see it?
With all due respect to Salman, I think, and I must say here, I do not represent the Qatari official line in any way. For every Qatari who's been linked to funding terrorism, there are at least 10 or 20 Saudis. And the whole perspective of creating the JASTA law in the United States came originally to counter what was perceived as Saudi funded terrorism. Now, put that aside, I think the real issue now is that the Gulf states seem to have reached a particular deal with the Trump administration. The Riyadh conference was key to this. They have all simultaneously or separately pointed fingers towards Qatar. My analysis that there are deeper reasons for that go beyond the surface analysis around terrorism at this stage. But if you like, we can discuss this at a later stage.
Well, tell me what's the deeper. Tell me what that deeper reason is. If you had to tell me in a couple of words, what is that deeper reason?
Well, I think both Saudi Arabia and Emirates lack the stability internally that Qatar enjoys, which allows Qatar to see things in gray colors. They do not draw lines black and white. So when they talk about Islamic movements, they have the confidence to deal with a whole range of a rainbow, if you like, of colors of political Islam. And they can very clearly, as does Turkey, and this is a very important point of connection between the two, they can draw a clear distinction between a global movement like the Muslim Brotherhood, which has millions of followers that you cannot by any sense call them terrorists, and a small fringe group like ISIL. Now, unfortunately, in the Emirates, they're incapable of doing this. They have labeled the whole millions of people who who follow the Muslim Brotherhood or believe in its principles and so on as terrorists. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not going to end terrorism in our region. If anything, it's going to make it worse, and it's going to lead us from one bad episode to a worse one to come.
Okay, interesting points there. So, Salman, Turkey and Qatar see nuance. They see colors, they see variations in these movements. And maybe just to add to what Sultan was saying, you see in the UAE, you can go to jail for 15 years if you just express solidarity, sympathy with Qatar during this latest diplomatic spat. It does add weight to his argument, right? That for the Saudis and the Emiratis, in this particular context, they see things in black and white, and you're with us or you're with the terrorists. He's right, isn't he?
It's actually not like that at all. What I'm trying to say is terrorism should always be defined as terrorism. There is no gray area on this, and this should be respected by all the nations. If any nation decides to crack down all terrorist networks and all terrorist propagandists, then this should be actually clapped for, and we should be celebrating having those countries to be in the forefront of combating terrorism. The idea that Qatar in the past wanted to make itself like the main conduit to non-state actors in the region and the world, this is a failing card. You cannot play with that card. As long you are actually...
But why not? I mean, when I lived in Doha, I mean, you go to a five-star hotel, you'll see the Darfuri rebels negotiating with the government there. You see all sorts of different movements having their meetings. Qatar saw itself as a sort of negotiating partner. Why not have some sort of conduit?
Good. If you want to be a negotiating partner, let's keep it as it is. But if you go to the extra milestone and support terrorist groups with cash and weapons, then there is a red line that this should not be crossed. And that's what the Qatari has been doing. It's not me saying this. It's not the Saudis saying this. It's not the GCC. It's the whole world, specifically the United States. And there are reports about this, intelligence reports about this, of how Qatar has been actually using this Muslim Brotherhood kind of movement around the world to basically achieve its political ends by basically being the main Muslim Brotherhood supporters, because they have some sort of like maybe expansionistic behaviors, just like the radical Iranian regime. So let me just give you an example that can be understood by the Turkish people. Because Turkey is our friends and we appreciate our alliance with Turkey. But at the same time, there are things that they are not really seeing. What the Qatari is doing is exactly like what Fathallah Gulen is doing by having states within states, by having groups within countries that would actually create some kind of chaotic situations for the governments. This should be confronted by all means. We cannot tolerate this. There is no array of colors. This is a black and white matter. If there is a terrorist, we will confront him by all means.
Let me bring in Mithat Rende here. As a diplomat, sir, can Turkey really be pro-Qatar at this delicate moment without being anti-Saudi, anti-UAE, anti-Egypt, anti-GCC in general? Can it really do both those things at the same time?
First of all, let me just follow up on what has been said by your guests. We should be very careful not to discriminate between different groups and different terrorists. So we are very keen about that. And we know well that different groups have been probably financed or condoned or indoctrinated by different countries in the region. The problem is, I believe, we have the right environment, the right social environment to breed such people and to indoctrinate and brainwash them. So the countries of the region should refrain from mutual recriminations. They should look at their policies and they should sit and together and say, okay, we need to provide prosperity, we need to provide the right quality, good quality education to our people, not only indoctrinating and brainwashing people. So probably supporting certain religious groups is not in the monopoly of any country in the region. It's a fact of life that so many religious groups have been supported, financed, and condoned by different people who belong to different Gulf countries. For example, in the Gulf countries, we have NGOs and we have also governmentally organized NGOs. And we have also certain charities and there are businessmen who are dedicated to provide support to certain religious groups and these religious groups, unfortunately, sometimes they resort to fanaticism and unlawful acts. So this is the situation as I could see it when I was serving in the Gulf. As regards Turkey, I do believe that Turkey can play the force for good, and it can play with its potential, the soft power, and if we are to enhance and further improve our cooperation in all fields with Qatar, it doesn't mean that this is against other countries of the Gulf. It is against Saudi Arabia or against Egypt, because our intention is probably we should have normalized our relationship with Egypt long time ago. I regret personally that we don't have an ambassador today, as of today, in Egypt. We should be able to talk to each other, even if we have political differences and we have ideological probably differences. But we believe that with Qatar we can continue to work together. As regards the deployment of forces or the base, we should also recall that there are many countries, and Qatar concluded many agreements with other countries who have air bases in and deployed forces in Qatar. So it's not just only Turkey.
Yeah, one of the countries that has a base
to build an air base.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Sure, we are running out of time, sir. So I apologize for interrupting. One of the countries that does have a base is, of course, the United States, and they seem to have been a little bit schizophrenic here. So you have Donald Trump saying Qatar supports terrorism, fully endorsing what's happening with the GCC countries. His Secretary of State playing it a little bit differently. He's saying, well, we're calling for an end to the blockade, and this might hamper the efforts against fighting Daesh in Syria and the Syria policy in general. I wonder what you think of that, Sultan. Do you believe that this is going to hamper the fight against Daesh? And do you believe that the US actually has a policy, given that the president is saying one thing and the Secretary of State is saying something else?
Well, I think the US may have been taken by surprise, like everybody else, in relation to the extent of sanctions that were taken by the Gulf states against Qatar. It became clear that they have pointed the finger to Qatar, But I think nobody anticipated that the measures taken will be just one grade below an open war. To cut all relations, to demand your citizens to leave a country, to stop the use of airspace, etc. These are all drastic measures that the Gulf United never took against their arch enemy Iran since 1979. We have a situation here, like in the Emirates, where the trade this year has been something like 40 billion between them and Iran, and it averaged on about 15 billion a year for the last 5-6 years, and they have never even tried to reduce that as a punishment to the Iranians that they see as the cause of all evil in the region.
Yeah, okay, I wish we could go on because this has been an important discussion, I think, but unfortunately I've got to move on in the program. Mithat Rende, Salman Al-Ansari and Sultan Barakat, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Coming up on the program, has a path opened up for Jeremy Corbyn to become the UK's next Prime Minister? And police in Sao Paulo make mass arrests through the city's so-called Crackland. What a difference 24 hours can make in a UK election. On Saturday, a little-known political party called the DUP threw its weight behind Prime Minister Theresa May. The coalition allowed her to stay in Downing Street following last week's snap election. Or so we thought. DUP leaders came forward the very next day to say a deal has yet to be made. So while this segment was going to be about Brexit negotiations, we're going to talk about something that at one point was nearly unthinkable. Could Jeremy Corbyn become Britain's next Prime Minister? Well, to start the conversation, let's turn to Randolph Nogle, who's been reporting for us in the UK.
At this time, more than anything else, this country needs a period of stability.
Are you still supporting Mrs May?
Early days. It's early days, and
she's won the most seats, 56 seats more than Labour.
Oh yeah, I mean, Theresa May is a dead woman walking. It's just how long she's going to remain on death row.
A major political upset for the Conservatives has cast the future of the party and its leader into question. The election was meant to further secure the political dividends of the Brexit vote for the Tories.
The election has turned out to be about a lot more than just Brexit, because when the Conservatives released their manifesto at the beginning of the campaign, there were things in it which were instantly unpopular.
Some say the tide began to turn for the Tories with the so-called dementia tax, a measure which empowers the government to seize someone's home after they've died if they were unable to otherwise pay their in-home care medical bills. A snap election called by a party that sold itself to voters as strong and stable has led to more uncertainty than ever. Now the Conservatives face the prospect of having to cobble together cross-party support for Brexit negotiations, which are rapidly approaching. And even though the Tories remain the dominant party, the vote is widely seen as a victory for Labour and Jeremy Corbyn, a man once written off by much of Britain's political establishment.
The Prime Minister called the election because she wanted a mandate. Well, the mandate she's got is lost Conservative seats, lost votes, lost support and lost confidence.
Going back in time, the opinion polls have been steadily moving towards the exit. So really this is an inevitable consequence of Britain being forced into ever closer union, accepting more and more EU control without a referendum. They basically pushed the British people too far till we said, no, we're not happy with this, enough, we're going to run our own affairs.
Throughout the campaign, the Conservatives' major selling point was that Theresa May was the strongest leader to take the country through Brexit. UKIP, which played a large role in bringing about the referendum, was a part of the political calculus that had indicated an electoral Tory tsunami.
Now UKIP aren't standing, and there was this calculation that that vote would transfer directly to the Conservatives. That's not necessarily happening because people misread the types of people that were voting for UKIP. It was part of it was a protest vote, part of it was anger.
What also wasn't as apparent was that social issues would for many outweigh party agendas set around Brexit.
People on the doorstep are talking about cuts to the National Health Service, cuts to school budgets, and worries about the future.
People are starting to actually say, no, enough is enough. You know, this has gone on for too long. In terms of the economic arguments for austerity. I think they're failed.
The NHS and social services, any council funding has been depleted over many years, no matter what administration was in office.
John and Sue's parents are both ill, but it's their mother who at the moment is in need of the most care.
My mum worked for Harrow Council for about 30 years as a home carer. Now that it's her turn, there's nothing.
Because of a lack of available services, Sue has had to take a job closer to home that pays less than half of what she was making.
The problem is that these day centres, they will start at 10 and finish at 3. It is really difficult for people like us that are working people that can't afford the time to do all these things. We've already accepted that our parents' house will pay for any care that they need.
They've paid tax all their life, and now it's just another tax that they're making you forfeit your home to pay for your care.
While a great deal of uncertainty consumes national politics in the UK, many feel that their needs have gone unaddressed. And while talks over Brexit, which was propelled by the anger of so many working people, will soon begin, the question remains whether it will improve the lives of the everyday people who are struggling to get by. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers in London.
Well, let's go to our panel. Lembit Opik is in London. He's a Liberal Democrat and former Member of Parliament representing Montgomeryshire. Also in London, Aaron Bastani. He's a political commentator and a Jeremy Corbyn supporter. And in Kent, Jakes Arnold. He's a former Conservative Member of Parliament for Gravesham. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Jakes Arnold, if I can begin with you, sir. Do you agree with George Osborne that Prime Minister Theresa May is a dead woman walking?
I think the parliamentary party's got to make their mind up after an extremely unfortunate election. The Prime Minister made the same mistake that Ted Heath did. She posed a question to the electorate in respect of increasing her majority to negotiate Brexit, and the public said, we've decided that, we're bored, we'll ask different questions and we'll give a different answer. And she's got the same response Ted Heath did back in 1974. It cost us our majority and it cost him his job. It remains to be seen what the parliamentary party decide in respect of Theresa May. What we do know is very shortly the Brexit negotiations commence with our colleagues on the continent.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see who leads that, and we'll get to that in a moment or two. Lembit Opik, she's thrown away the majority that the Conservatives had. They had incredible confidence going into this. What do you think gave them or inspired such misplaced, in retrospect, confidence going into this election?
Quite simply, the polls had given them a lead which no government has seen in 3 decades mid-term in the United Kingdom. And when you've got a 20 or 21 percentage point lead over the number 2 party, the Labour Party, I suppose it is tempting to call an election, but it was a catastrophic mistake. They believed, if you like, the hubris which they themselves generated. There was a second problem as well. They made it look like Jeremy Corbyn was a terrible loser, somebody who's incompetent, not credible and unelectable. And to an extent, even Jeremy Corbyn's own party thought that, but the electorate didn't. And as a result, what we saw was Jeremy Corbyn doing well and Theresa May taking a tumble and spending probably an 8-figure sum, maybe £15 million, to throw away a working majority. And that is a kind of suicide in politics.
Yeah. Aaron, let's talk about those even within the Labour Party who didn't really rate Jeremy Corbyn. I know you supported him. I know you're a Jeremy Corbyn fan, but I read op-ed after op-ed in The Independent, in The Guardian, and so on. Corbyn's not the man. He's unelectable. He's going to lose this election very badly against the Tories. And there you go. Young people vote, and they vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Was the secret to his success, Aaron, that he just wasn't Theresa May?
No, it was a lot more than that. Labour just won 12.8 million votes. That's more than any general election since 1997. It's the 5th highest number of votes they've ever won. It was a 9% swing. So for your audience, that's the biggest swing in British politics for any party since 1945. They won seats in England, Wales and Scotland. In London, they won 54%. Where I'm from, in Bournemouth West, they won 36%. Even in 1997, with that thumping majority that Tony Blair won, they got 24%. So they haven't won this election. They're still 60 short of a majority. But what they've done is become incredibly competitive overnight, and they're now second and very well placed to win, I would say, actually 100 seats. There's nothing that you can take for granted in politics, especially after Brexit. But they're definitely in the driving seat now to win a big majority come the next general election. So you can't just say this was a vote against Theresa May. It was a massive turnout, particularly amongst the young. And we have, it seems initially, some figures indicate overall turnout was 68, 69%, 18 to 24's turnout, 72%. That's absolutely remarkable. If it's correct, it's without precedent, I think, not just in British politics, but actually European or North American politics. So we have a tidal wave here of support for Jeremy Corbyn. It's built upon the young, amongst ethnic minorities, amongst women, and amongst those who've been left behind.
Okay.
And that's the coalition which I think will send him to 10 Downing Street ultimately.
So let me ask Jake Arnold then. Putting Theresa May aside, that's one person. She called for the election. She's the Prime Minister, and the buck stops with her, right? But you have an entire party, the ruling party, tremendously confident going into this election. The polls were on your side. You won, but by very little. I mean, it's like, you know, in cricket, enforcing the follow-on, and the opposition bats out for a draw, I guess. Why did the Conservatives so badly misread the pulse of the nation? Where did you guys get it wrong?
I think the matter of it is Theresa May read it totally wrong and then ran a campaign that was crass in the extreme. The elephant in the room in this election was the economy. The facts of the matter are that the Labour Party, when it left office in 2010, left us with a running deficit of £148 billion. Somehow, successive governments have had to reel back on that deficit while still shoveling money into the health service and into education, which we have done. It's not easy, it's painful. We're all paying the pain for the incompetence of the last Labour government. And the sad thing is that Jeremy Corbyn has behaved like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, suggesting we can spend everything on this. Somehow the rich and business will pay for it, and what they don't, they'll be able to just borrow. Okay. And all will be well.
Okay, I've got two shaking heads. Yes. Okay, so we've got a split screen here. I've got two shaking heads here, so I'm going to have Lembit have a crack at it first before Aaron. Lembit?
Yeah, that's just not accurate. In the sense that the complaint you're making about Labour can just as well be directed towards the Conservatives. It was your former Chancellor, George Osborne, who promised to balance the books, and they're nowhere near balanced. I suspect that no government can really balance the books without creating intolerable austerity, so I don't really blame the government, the Conservatives, for not doing it. I do blame you for saying that the Labour Party failed when your party made it. Well, I don't think that the books can be balanced. I think that you probably have to have a running deficit as it is. That's a debate about economics. Let's look at what you've said and what you've criticised Labour for. Your party, the Conservatives, did exactly the same thing when they were in government. And let's not pretend. We all know that this election was called in order to try and increase the Conservative majority. Something went terribly wrong there, and that was probably about something called dementia tax. We can talk about that in a minute. Okay. But something went very right with Jeremy Corbyn because he was talking about other things that people wanted to hear. For example, policy regarding international terrorism. That's nothing to do with economics.
Okay. Aaron, the Conservative government just had to inherit a big mess from Labour. That's what Jake Arnold's saying.
That's a load of nonsense. The deficit was very high when the Tories took power, absolutely. But Margaret Thatcher did not. She ran one surplus in her time as Prime Minister. The Tory Prime Minister who ran a few surpluses was John Major when Ken Clarke was Chancellor. The truth is, Britain has run deficit after deficit basically since the late 1970s. That's a problem which grows out of a crisis of international... Excuse me? Excuse me?
Certainly not on this scale.
Well, Jake, actually, if you look at the figures in the early 90s...
in 1 year.
Jake, in the early 1990s, Britain was running a deficit higher than what we have today. Furthermore, wages are down 10.4% in the last 9 years. That's without precedent in Britain. Okay. Jake, excuse me. I didn't interrupt you, sir.
Okay. Aaron,
wages are down 10.4% in the last 9 years. That's got nothing to do with macroeconomics, James. This government has failed on pay, on productivity, on the deficit, on living standards. Enough is enough. We need to get them out.
OK, so let me take the economy and park it off for a moment, because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because we can have a really robust debate about the economy. But I'm trying to look at this in as big a picture as possible. Brexit negotiations coming up. Now, there were suggestions that Boris Johnson might be really happy about all of this because he might want to run for Prime Minister and so on. He refuted that. I'm loath to quote The Sun on the programme, but he wrote an op-ed in The Sun. So it has the headline, "To all of you urging Theresa May to quit and suggesting we need another election, I say, get a grip." He goes on to say the piece, he says, Theresa May led a campaign that inspired 13.7 million people to vote Conservative in the biggest total tally of Tory votes since the days of Margaret Thatcher. That is a stunning achievement for which she deserves the support of her party, and she will certainly get it from me. I guess that's one way of putting it from the Foreign Secretary. Does any of that resonate with you at all, looking forward, especially since now you have to get down to the business of the Brexit negotiations?
Of course he has to say this, even if he's planning a leadership bid, and I imagine he is. He's got to look like he's a complete loyalist now. Those who challenge an existing Prime Minister tend to have a very poor record of stepping into a deposed Prime Minister's shoes. So, of course, he's got to say that. Bear in mind also that Boris has said quite a lot of the things that Jeremy Corbyn has said, certainly associating international foreign policy with international terrorism. So he's in a spot. He's got to sound loyal. And frankly, whether Boris tells people to support Theresa May or not doesn't matter. Bear in mind, there are very powerful paymasters behind every party, including the Conservatives. They've pretty much decided that Theresa May can stay for now, but they need to have an exit plan from that. There's no prospect of her standing for leader during the next, as Prime Minister during the next election. One more little point here. It's absolutely not in Boris Johnson's interest to have a general election if he can avoid it now, because the Conservatives could well go down, and he doesn't want to be the leader of a minority party in opposition. OK,
Jakes Arnold, if there was another election, there was an election in 2015, 2016, 2017, if there's one in 2018, how likely is it that Labour will win?
Highly unlikely, because the people will now reflect on the whole business and they will consider the economy, which was not considered in the general election. What is significant is, after a dreadful campaign that didn't address the fundamentals of the economy, nevertheless the Conservatives won 42% of the vote. That is highly significant. Next time we may have a decently run campaign.
OK, so it sounds as if you're keen on another election. Aaron Bastani, I know you'd be keen on another election because
No, wait a minute.
OK.
Wait a minute on that.
OK.
I'm not keen on another election, because the further elephant in the room, which everybody forgot during the election campaign, was in very short order we're sitting down with our European colleagues to discuss the mechanics of how we carry out Brexit.
And who do you think will be able to do that, sir? Who do you think will be able to do that best, if not Theresa May?
It will be David Davis taking it in, and the Prime Minister of the day. At the moment, that looks like Theresa May, but it's up to the parliamentary party whether she remains in office in the medium term. The important point is we've got to negotiate Britain's departure from the European Union, and to find a settlement which will allow us to strengthen our trade, investment and commercial activity with the wider world, as well as coming to a deal which is in the interest of the European countries and ourselves. Right. Not an easy thing to do, and that's what we should be concentrating on.
OK, I've got just enough time for a final question for Aaron, so sorry, Lambert, I know you want to jump in, but Aaron, Brexit is happening. It will happen within the next 22 months or so. It's happening. A week ago, I guess it would have been a crazy question to ask if Jeremy Corbyn would be leading those negotiations, or if he had any chance of being the next Prime Minister in the short term. You're still confident of all of that happening, Aaron?
Yes, I believe there'll be another general election this year, and I think the Labour will win a thumping majority. How we'll do that is we will have increased voter registration. We only had 6 weeks, bear in mind, to register all these young people. We're going to register a whole lot more, believe me. So that's going to be the bulwark of this. I was in Hastings over the weekend. We lost there by 200. I believe we'll get a majority of 5,000 there this year. There is a hunger for a different kind of country, a country for the many, not the few. Jake isn't in touch with that. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. We'll win a majority government this year.
OK, it's a lively time in the UK. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Lambert Opik,
Thank you.
Aaron Bastani and Jake Arnold. Thanks so much.
So I'm a hip-hop artist from London. My name is Loki, and I am a Jeremy Corbyn supporter.
Ahmed, not Ahmed, it's Ahmed, he's that dead. Toddler lying lifeless on the beach with his back bent, arms spread, reaching the direction that is.
I think the strongest impression one takes when they would meet Jeremy Corbyn would be the impression of humility and a willingness to listen. And I think this is the most important part of public service. The discourse which is being used by the other side not only alienates young people, but it also actually now alienates older people. These conversations are taking place without our participation, and it doesn't matter what we say or think, we won't have any influence upon them. And so that is the crux of the matter with Jeremy Corbyn, and the way that he has managed to set alight the imaginations of young people, because they've seen clearly that now we have somebody who's receptive to these movements and receptive to our ideas, and is not prioritizing the sort of sacrosanct march of industry. Now, what Jeremy Corbyn represents is a dissent. When we look at the way that in this country now, for example, according to BBC figures, not according to my figures, there's 250,000 people homeless. Within the capital, there's 1 in 59 people homeless within the capital. You have millions of children in this country officially growing up in poverty, and 2/3 of them come from homes where both the parents work. Now that's significant. When you have Jeremy Corbyn coming in and saying he will raise the minimum wage, he has vowed to address the housing crisis by building 1 million homes, half of them social housing. These are significant and massively important things which will affect future generations of this society. On top of that, you have the example of university fees being essentially commandeered and harnessed by the lords of debt, whereby you have what is essentially a Robin Hood in reversal redistribution of wealth upwards, clawing young people into debt. So you have Theresa May not posting once on her social networks, register to vote, not once. Whereas the Labour Party were saying register, and you had 2 million people register, and a lot of them were young people. Now, when we're looking at the policies of in the Labour manifesto, we clearly see them affecting young people's lives in a major, important and serious way. The way that I perceive myself, and the way that also a lot of musicians are, they are conduits. Mainly in this day and age, in this neoliberal era, they're conduits for big business most of the time. But if you can be a conduit for subversive ideas, a conduit for challenging ideas, a conduit for ideas which foster and encourage empathy rather than encourage and emphasize difference, that forge bonds across chasms of alienation between people, then I think that is a very fortunate position to be in, and I'm very lucky to be in that position.
I ended up voting Conservative because I didn't really believe in the Labour's policies that much. I kind of thought they were pulling their policies out of the air and not really backing up where they were going to get money to do stuff from.
Well, 2/3 of young voters turned out for Labour in this election, but it wasn't enough to give the party an all-out win. Bucking the Liberal trend are people like Eleanor Job and 18-year-old student Ali Fazal, who joins me now. He campaigned for the Conservative Party in the city of Birmingham. Ali, good to talk to you. Are you disappointed?
And you? Well, no, not necessarily. Sure, we lost the majority. We didn't do as well as we expected to. But no, I'm not disappointed because the Prime Minister still has a mandate. We could have done a much better job, but we are where we are, and we have to make the best of the situation we're in.
Most of the young people your age and a little bit older, all the way up to, say, 30 or so, voted Labour. They came out in record numbers. They wanted change, and they saw Jeremy Corbyn as their man and the Labour Party's platform as their reason. What makes you so different? Why did you choose the Conservatives?
Sure. Well, I think what you'll find when you actually go to the doorstep and on the streets is that there are vast numbers of young people who actually back the Conservatives too. This narrative that it's just the Labour Party that young people back is not the case at all. If you look at what the Conservatives have achieved over the last 7 years, the economic successes of the Conservative government...
No, I don't want to patronise you, but I'm looking at the data. I'm not talking about people on the streets. I'm talking about the actual data of the election. Young people voted for Labour, right?
No doubt, Jeremy Corbyn has done a brilliant job by getting young people out and actually getting them much more involved in politics. But if you're asking me why I'm a Conservative as a young person, it's about values. It's about my values of aspiration, my values of ambition, my values of wanting to live in a meritocratic society where it's your hard work, your ambition, your talent and your merit that gets you where you want to be. It's about your ambition, not the state's ambition for you. And if you look at what the Conservatives have achieved over the last 7 years, we've seen record levels of people in work. These are young people also getting into work. We've seen record levels of people who are now who are in employment, but also if you look at the level of people who are now out of paying taxes altogether, that is the personal allowance which is going up under this Conservative government. That's 4,000 more than it was under a Labour government. Right. That means people from lower income backgrounds do not have to pay as much tax under this government because that is a Conservative commitment to ensure that we are looking after the people right at the bottom of the income scale. Okay. These are values that I'm very proud and that's why I'm a Conservative, yeah. Right,
so you're saying, you know, Conservative values, you're saying meritocracy, you're saying they'd handle the economy better. There are a lot of people, and I'm sure you've heard this before, who'll say, hey, when you're 18, you have to be a liberal, or in your 20s, even if you end up becoming a Conservative, even if you end up becoming a Conservative leader of the party, everybody's a liberal when they're young. Why are you so different?
Well, I wouldn't say that's the case. I mean, there are massive groups of Conservative young people. We have, even in my school, we have a number of Conservatives, young Conservatives. It is not rare at all the way you make it seem. Sure, the data shows that there are the vast number of young people were voting Labour. But I think what really got people out there voting for Jeremy Corbyn and voting for the Labour Party with regards to young people was some of his pledges like free tuition fees or scrapping the debts that so many young people now see when they leave university.
And that's a good thing, right?
Policies are well, no, because those policies are simply economically unsustainable. When tuition fees was free, we saw only 3% of students from doing A-levels going into university. That figure has now gone up by around by around 8, or it was 5%, and that figure has now gone up by around 8 times. So now we see around 41% of students who now do A-levels going on to go into university. To claim that we can still have free education when we have so many more young people going into university, that is not the case. Right. It is simply economically unsustainable.
No, and that's a classical Conservative argument. Fair enough. No, fair enough. You're saying who's going to pay for it?
No, can I just finish? One second. Because not only that, but also the Labour Party talk about social mobility. The fact that if we scrap tuition fees, then we'll see a lot more young people actually going to university. If you look at Scotland, where tuition fees is actually free for locals, there is no such thing as tuition fees for locals, you see 20% fewer working class children actually going to university. Okay. So to claim that by scrapping tuition fees we're allowing more students from lower incomes to go to university, that simply isn't the case. But this is Labour's style.
I want to jump in. Allow me to jump in so I can get in one final.
The bottom line is there is no silver bullet.
Sure, I want to get in one final question here, and you make a fair argument there. The Liberals, Labour, have the narrative, they have the charisma, they feel Jeremy Corbyn listens to them, he listens to the street, whereas, you know, the Tories are kind of disconnected and elitist and so on. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. This is how a lot of young people feel. So my question to you as a young Conservative, how are you going to try to convince other young people to come over to your side?
Well, I think you've raised a really, really fair point, because a lot of people feel disconnected from, a lot of young people feel disconnected not only from politics, but from the Conservative Party as well. And that is, there's no hiding away from that fact. But I think it's about re-engaging young people. And I think what you have already seen through this election is not all young people blindly following Labour Party politics. That is not the case. And I think trying to engage more young people through discussions, through forums, through the kind of thing we do at my college, which is discussion circles around politics, coming together, actually talking about policies, scrutinising manifestos to a level where young people can actually understand the nitty-gritty points, because that's the only way you can actually get young people involved, understanding the actual policies, the philosophy behind those policies, and actually allowing them to understand where they sit on the political spectrum.
Ali, Fazal, I have a feeling I'm going to be talking to you a lot in the coming years. Let's see if that happens. It's been good to talk to you. Thanks so much. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, we look at the battle for Raqqa. Will this be the final chapter in eliminating Daesh? Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.